You shouldn't be here, Ethan whispered to himself, the words swallowed instantly by the roar of the desert wind as he trudged through the endless dunes, the scorching sun baking his neck and the fine sand slipping past his boots with every cautious step. His eyes caught a shimmer in the distance, a faint outline half buried beneath the dunes, and he froze, pulse hammering against his ribs. The shape was enormous, impossibly so, a glimpse of green-blue skin glinting where the sand had given way, and a subtle hum seemed to vibrate from it, resonating through the scorching air. Ethan crouched, squinting, the metallic edge of his sample kit catching the sun, tossing flecks of light across the shifting sands, and a soft hiss sliced through the wind, sharp and warning, almost human but alien in tone. He swallowed hard, aware that every instinct screamed to retreat, yet something held him rooted, curiosity mingled with an unspoken urge to understand. Step by careful step, he approached, the sand giving way beneath him with quiet whispers, until he was close enough to see her eyes flicker open, massive and glimmering with colors he had no words for, wary, alert, alive. The desert stretched endlessly behind them, orange and gold waves of sand rolling under the harsh sun, yet in that moment the world shrank to just two beings, two presences vibrating with tension and unspoken questions. Ethan noticed the fine sheen of dust across her shoulders and the slight tremor in her posture, signs of struggle, vulnerability hidden beneath the scale of her form. He extended a hand, not in threat but in cautious offer, and she recoiled slightly, his fading to a low growl of uncertainty, eyes never leaving his. Sweat dripped from his temple, burning as it caught in the grit, yet he did not step back. A piece of desert metal, jagged and weathered, lay nearby, and he used it to carefully brush away the sand clinging to her form, revealing more of the glinting patterns along her arms that caught the sunlight like fragments of a strange jewel. The wind rose, whipping through the dunes, carrying with it a cloud of grit that blurred the horizon, yet in the swirling chaos, their forms were clear against the golden backdrop, a tableau of unlikely connection. He whispered again, soft but firm, "It's okay." And in that moment, the tension between caution and need, fear and curiosity, hung thick in the air. Her eyes narrowed, scanning him, searching perhaps for deceit, yet found nothing but steadiness, humanity in motion, hands moving gently, deliberately, bridging the silent gap. The sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the rippling sands, and Ethan could feel time stretching, holding them in fragile balance. Every grain of sand a reminder of the desert's harsh law, every heartbeat a proof of life and presence. Zyra's chest rose and fell slowly, cautiously, as if measuring the rhythm of trust, and though she remained still, a small shift in her posture suggested the beginning of acknowledgement, a recognition of intent, a whisper of connection that had no words but a world of meaning. The golden glow of evening began to glaze the peaks of the dunes, lights softening edges, colors deepening into richer hues, and Ethan lowered himself slightly, offering water with careful hands, letting droplets catch the last rays, shining like tiny lanterns in the settling shadows. And as the wind continued its relentless dance, a subtle sense of equilibrium formed, the first fragile step toward understanding, the desert itself seeming to pause, bearing witness to a moment suspended between fear, wonder, and the quiet stirrings of trust. The sun dipped lower behind the dunes, turning the sand into molten gold as Ethan knelt beside Zyra, carefully adjusting the makeshift bandages he had crafted with strips of cloth from his pack. Her enormous eyes followed every movement, a mix of wariness and fascination reflecting in the iridescent light across her skin, and Ethan spoke softly, his voice barely above the whisper of the wind, explaining nothing, offering only calm and steadiness. He filled a small container with the last of his water and extended it toward her, droplets glinting like tiny stars as they caught the fading sun, and after a long pause, Zyra tilted her massive head, allowing a single sip, the act a quiet acknowledgement that she was beginning to trust him. The desert wind stirred around them, carrying grains of sand that sparkled like scattered jewels in the warm evening glow, and Ethan used the moment to scan the horizon, noting the shifting shadows and distant heat mirages while maintaining his attention on Zyra, whose posture gradually relaxed, shoulders lowering and her breathing evening out, subtle signs of calm in contrast to the initial tension. He talked to her softly, naming the few tools and objects he had with him, describing their functions with slow, deliberate clarity, creating a rhythm that was both grounding and safe, and she observed silently, eyes following his hands, learning without words. The temperature dropped slightly as the sun sank further, the air cooling and carrying a hint of crispness that contrasted with the scorching daytime heat, and Ethan shared a small portion of his rations, breaking the food into tiny pieces to offer to her, and she accepted them cautiously, eyes scanning his face for intent, finding nothing but human patience and care. Shadows lengthened across the sand dunes, their contours deepening into rich hues of orange and red, and the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant rock and dried vegetation, something Zyra seemed to recognize instinctively. Pausing to inhale deeply, nostrils flaring, and then relaxing as if grounding herself in the environment with Ethan beside her. The golden light faded into a soft lavender dusk, and Ethan led her to a slight depression in the sand, creating a temporary shelter by arranging his equipment to shield her from the wind, careful to maintain distance yet close enough to offer comfort, and they settled into an uneasy companionship that was quiet yet profoundly charged with unspoken understanding. He noticed the faint twitch of her fingers against the sand as if feeling for the vibrations beneath, and he mirrored her attentiveness, letting his hands hover nearby, a silent gesture of solidarity, and the desert around them became a living entity in its own right, the shifting dunes, whispering winds, and cooling air forming a backdrop for the fragile trust that was forming. As night fell, stars emerged one by one, pinpricks of light in the deepening sky, and Ethan traced constellations, pointing out shapes with his finger, not expecting Zyra to comprehend, yet seeing her eyes follow the motion, catching reflections of light that seemed to bridge the gap between alien perception and human understanding. In that quiet, suspended space, the enormity of her presence juxtaposed with the gentle humanity of his actions created a fragile harmony, the desert wind carrying both the sound of shifting sand and a tentative sense of connection, the first real bond forming under the vast, indifferent sky. The first stars pricked the deepening sky as Ethan and Zyra shifted slightly, adjusting to the cool night air that settled over the desert, each breath drawing the chill into their lungs and the quiet between them growing dense with the weight of unspoken trust. Ethan moved deliberately, gathering small stones and arranging them into a boundary that marked a safe space for her, his fingers brushing lightly against the grains of sand, careful to show care without intrusion, and Zyra observed every motion, the glint of curiosity mingling with caution in her luminous eyes. The wind whispered through the dunes, carrying the faint scent of distant rocks and dried flora, and Zyra tilted her head, nostrils flaring to capture the nuances, then exhaled slowly, a signal of recognition and acceptance, a soft sound that barely disturbed the stillness. Ethan took a slow step closer, not forcing proximity but offering presence, his shadow stretching across the sand like a bridge, and he extended a small device that projected a gentle, pulsing light, designed to help her see clearly in the growing darkness. She shifted slightly, eyes narrowing, then finally leaned into the light, the delicate glow reflecting on her patterned skin, highlighting the intricate lines and subtle textures that made her alien yet tangible. The temperature continued to drop, and Ethan offered a small piece of cloth to cover part of her form, the gesture simple yet deliberate, emphasizing protection and care, and Zyra accepted, her massive fingers curling around the fabric, the touch hesitant but deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of connection. Around them, the desert seemed to breathe in rhythm with their cautious movements, sand rippling in miniature waves across the dunes, stars reflected faintly in the scattered surfaces, and Ethan spoke softly, narrating the constellations, pointing out patterns in the sky, each word measured, deliberate, designed to instill calm and familiarity. Zyra's eyes followed the motion, the faint glimmer of recognition passing through her gaze, an understanding that transcended language, the shared experience weaving a fragile thread between human and alien perception. Time stretched as the night deepened, the vast desert turning into a canvas of shadow and starlight, each sound amplified by the stillness. Each subtle gesture weighted with significance, and Ethan sensed her becoming attuned to his presence, her posture relaxing, the initial tension easing into a quiet alertness that was neither fear nor aggression but anticipation. The faint light of the projected device reflected in her eyes, casting tiny points of luminescence across the sand, and Ethan observed, noting the shift in her breathing, the subtle lowering of shoulders, the soft flex of fingers adjusting to the contours of the ground, small movements that signaled acceptance and comprehension. The night air carried both chill and promise, wrapping around them as the dunes stretched endlessly, and in that expanse of silence and shared attention, a bond began to take shape, fragile yet undeniable, built from mutual awareness and gentle persistence, a quiet testament to the human instinct to connect and the alien capacity to respond, forming a bridge between worlds that had once seemed impossibly distant. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert, softening the sharp edges of the dunes with a pale golden hue, and Ethan adjusted his pack, moving carefully beside Zyra, whose massive form cast long, undulating shadows on the sand. The night had left a crisp chill in the air, and each breath they drew carried the scent of dry stone and sparse vegetation, grounding them in the reality of the desert. Ethan carefully unpacked a small reflective panel, angling it to catch the early sunlight, creating a gentle, warm glow that spread across Zyra's patterned skin, and she tilted her head toward it, eyes tracking the light, curious yet cautious. He spoke softly, describing the purpose of the panel and how it could help navigate the shifting dunes, his voice calm and deliberate, a counterpoint to the restless wind, and Zyra shifted slightly, moving one massive hand over the sand, testing its texture, responding to the subtle variations, learning and observing without words. The air was filled with the soft whisper of wind over sand, a steady rhythm that matched Ethan's careful movements, and he offered small samples of water and food, gesturing for Zyra to take them as they traveled slowly, deliberately across the undulating terrain. Each step Ethan took was measured, ensuring stability on the loose sand, while Zyra's enormous frame followed, careful to mirror his pace, a silent cooperation forming as the desert stretched endlessly around them. The horizon began to blaze with the sun's ascent, painting the sky in gradients of pink and orange, and the temperature warmed gently, drying the cool dew that had settled overnight, while shadows retreated across the dunes, revealing patterns in the sand that had been hidden in darkness. Ethan paused, at the crest of a dune, scanning the distant landscape, noting ridges and valleys that could provide shelter or vantage, and he gestured toward them, explaining the safest route with hand signals and quiet speech, and Zyra's eyes followed, absorbing his guidance with cautious attention. A subtle sense of harmony had developed, the rhythm of their movements, the pacing of their steps, and the silent coordination forming a delicate understanding between human and alien, bridging the gap with patient observation and shared purpose. Small birds stirred in distant shrubs, their calls sharp against the soft rush of wind, and Zyra flinched at the sudden sound, then relaxed when Ethan reached out and touched the sand between them, an anchor of reassurance, a tactile reminder of safety and steadiness. The morning sun climbed higher, light glinting off sand crystals, shimmering across Zyra's skin and highlighting intricate patterns etched like natural art, and Ethan spoke in low, even tones about the features of the desert, connecting them to practical guidance and subtle beauty, and Zyra's gaze followed, reflective, taking in both instruction and wonder. As they moved together, a quiet bond solidified, composed not of words but of gestures, attentiveness, and careful action, the vast desert around them stretching into infinity, a canvas for trust forming step by measured step. Shadows shortened and melted into the rising light, and Ethan felt the fragile connection strengthening, each movement a proof of understanding and shared intent, Zyra's enormous eyes flicking between his hands, his gestures, and the path ahead, the quiet companionship growing beneath the vast, awakening sky. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, and Ethan led Zyra along a ridge where the sand fell away into gentle slopes. each step deliberate to maintain balance on the shifting dunes. The wind carried a soft, dry rustle, brushing across their feet and fingers, and Ethan pointed to distant rock formations, explaining how to use their shadows and angles to judge the terrain safely. Zyra tilted her head, eyes reflecting the sunlight as she observed the patterns in the sand, the slight differences in color and texture, and mimicked his movements with careful precision, testing the stability of each step before committing her weight. He offered small sips of water, holding the container steady for her massive hands, droplets catching the sunlight like tiny crystals, and she accepted, her breathing steadying, a quiet trust forming in the shared rhythm of survival. They paused near a shallow depression in the dunes, the sand cooler here, and Ethan placed a reflective panel to catch the sun, projecting light to help Zyra navigate through a subtle undulation in the terrain, and she followed the beam, eyes attentive, adjusting her steps with cautious grace. The air shimmered in the heat, waves rising from the sand, and Ethan explained the effects, using gestures and careful speech to ensure clarity, and Zyra watched, learning not just the mechanics but the patience inherent in understanding a new environment. As they moved, small details of the desert became points of interaction. A particular texture of sand indicating firmness, the faint scent of a distant shrub suggesting water beneath, and Ethan demonstrated, letting her experience through touch and observation, fostering a bond through shared knowledge. The sunlight highlighted the intricate lines along Zyra's skin, and Ethan spoke softly about the reflections, the way light could help them gauge distances and shadows, integrating instruction with observation, each moment reinforcing cautious collaboration. Shadows stretched longer as the morning progressed, and the temperature rose gently, warming the cool air, and Ethan adjusted their path to follow a ridge that would give better visibility, pausing often to check her footing, offering support without intrusion, their movements synchronizing silently. Zyra's attention remained focused, her massive eyes scanning every subtle cue, her breathing matching the rhythm of their progress, and Ethan's hands moved to demonstrate direction and measurement, small gestures carrying reassurance and clarity. The desert around them shifted subtly with each passing moment, the dunes rising and falling like golden waves, and the wind brought distant scents and sounds, all absorbed by Zyra as she continued to learn from Ethan's careful guidance. They reached a plateau with a clear view of the horizon, the desert stretching endlessly, and Ethan gestured toward distant markers, explaining their significance with calm precision, and Zyra responded by mimicking his observations, a silent acknowledgement that the lessons were being understood and absorbed. The sunlight reflected off her skin in soft patterns, highlighting both the alien and the alive in her presence, and together they stood quietly, the shared experience deepening their connection, each aware of the other, moving as a cautious, synchronized unit under the vast, open sky of the desert. The afternoon sun hung low, casting elongated shadows across the rippling dunes as Ethan guided Zyra through a narrow valley, the sand shifting under her enormous feet with a muted rumble that echoed faintly in the still air. He moved deliberately, pointing to subtle cues in the landscape, the slope of a dune, a cluster of rocks providing cover from gusts of wind, and the faint line of darker sand indicating a firmer path beneath. Zyra observed, tilting her head and tracing the contours with her eyes, then followed carefully, each movement measured, demonstrating growing understanding and trust. Ethan offered small sips of water, holding the container steadily so that she could drink comfortably, and she accepted, her posture relaxing incrementally as the trust between them deepened. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant stones and dried desert flora, and Zyra inhaled deeply, adjusting to the new signals, her breathing slow and deliberate, matching Ethan's calm rhythm. The sunlight glinted off her patterned skin, catching subtle textures that shimmered like metallic dust, and Ethan commented softly on the reflections, using them to gauge distances and provide practical guidance while maintaining a steady presence. Small adjustments of footing became a silent conversation, a shared learning process, and the space between them was filled with attentiveness rather than words, each action building on the previous, forming a rhythm of cautious cooperation. Ethan paused on a slight rise, letting Zyra catch up, and gestured toward a distant ridge where the sand held firm beneath the sun, explaining through gesture and quiet speech the safest route forward. She studied the route, eyes reflecting both light and concentration, and then moved in synchronization with his guidance, a silent acknowledgement of learning and compliance. The temperature shifted subtly as the day progressed, the air warming against their skin, and Ethan shaded her from the harshest rays with his reflective panel, demonstrating both care and awareness of the environmental challenges. Distant shadows and shapes of dunes created natural markers, and he pointed them out, helping Zyra interpret her surroundings with increased confidence. Each step became part of a growing partnership, subtle communication flowing through gestures, observation, and careful interaction with the environment. The dunes stretched endlessly around them, waves of sand catching the sun in gradients of gold and bronze, and the wind whispered faintly, carrying small grains that glittered briefly before settling, echoing the quiet persistence of the desert itself. Ethan maintained, focus on her posture, movements, and breathing, responding with gentle adjustments, guiding without intrusion, and Zyra mirrored him in motion and awareness, a testament to the bond forming between human and alien. As they reached a broader plateau, the horizon unfolded into a vast panorama of desert and sky, and the subtle harmony of their coordination revealed the growing trust, a fragile but undeniable connection shaped by patience, observation, and the shared challenge of navigating the endless, shimmering dunes under the expansive desert sun. The late afternoon sun cast long, wavering shadows across the dunes as Ethan noticed a sudden shift in the wind, a flurry of fine sand sweeping across the plateau, carrying with it the crisp scent of distant rocks and desert shrubs. Zyra paused, her massive form bracing against the current, eyes narrowing as she assessed the change, and Ethan stepped closer, his movements deliberate and steady, offering presence and reassurance without crowding her space. The sand beneath their feet shifted unevenly, a small collapse revealing a hidden pocket of loose earth, and Ethan instinctively reached out, steadying her with careful gestures that mirrored the gentle firmness he had used throughout their journey. Zyra's eyes met his, a flicker of recognition and trust reflecting in their depths, and she tilted her head slightly, leaning into the guidance as he demonstrated the safest path through the unstable terrain. The desert sun shimmered on her iridescent skin, highlighting subtle patterns and textures that danced with each movement, and Ethan used a small reflective panel to cast light along the uneven path, showing the safest footholds and helping her adjust her stance with caution and precision. They moved in synchrony, Ethan providing guidance with minimal touch and clear, deliberate gestures, Zyra responding with careful, mirrored steps, and the wind carried the quiet rhythm of sand cascading across the dunes, a constant, natural pulse accompanying their movement. Small details of the terrain became shared markers, a particular ridge, a cluster of stones, and Ethan used these cues to communicate distance and direction, which Zyra absorbed and incorporated into her navigation, her breathing slow and deliberate, matching the cadence he had established. The sun dipped lower, bathing the landscape in warm amber tones, elongating shadows and accentuating the textures of the sand, and Ethan paused at a higher vantage point to allow Zyra to rest, gesturing toward the horizon to show how. The dunes would rise and fall, preparing her for the next segment of travel. She observed intently, nodding subtly, her massive hands brushing the sand to test stability and absorb information through touch as well as sight. Ethan handed her a small container of water, steadying it so she could drink comfortably, and she accepted, careful and measured, a silent acknowledgement of trust. The plateau stretched ahead, undulating in golden waves, and each movement they made was deliberate, cautious, and yet fluid, a testament to the bond that had grown between them, one of mutual awareness, patience, and silent cooperation. The wind shifted again, softening in gusts that danced across their forms, carrying the distant scent of desert flora and the subtle echo of shifting sand, and Ethan observed Zyra adjusting her steps with intuitive understanding, learning from his guidance, and forming her own sense of rhythm with the desert. As they paused briefly at a gentle crest, the horizon wide and open before them, The subtle harmony between human and alien was palpable, each aware of the other's movements, breaths, and presence, a quiet partnership forged through careful action, attentiveness, and the shared challenge of traversing the vast, shimmering dunes under the expansive sky of the desert. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting long streaks of amber and violet across the desert sky as Ethan paused on the edge of a dune, scanning the undulating landscape for safe paths and potential shelter. Zyra shifted beside him, her massive form reflecting the fading light, patterns on her skin glowing faintly in the soft evening glow, and she extended one enormous hand to trace the edge of the sand, testing its stability. Ethan held out a small reflective panel, angling it so the last rays of sunlight would guide her steps through the uneven terrain, and she followed carefully, eyes tracking each subtle shimmer, adapting to the cues with precision and trust. The wind had softened, carrying only a gentle murmur of sand over the dunes, and Ethan spoke in calm, deliberate tones, pointing to distant rock formations and explaining how to use shadows and contours to navigate safely. Zyra's breathing was steady, her posture relaxed yet alert, mirroring Ethan's movements as they progressed along the plateau, the rhythm of their steps creating an unspoken cadence of cooperation. Small details of the desert were observed and shared, the texture of sand, the tilt of a dune, the slight variations in temperature and scent, and Ethan demonstrated how to interpret these cues, allowing Zyra to learn through observation and subtle guidance rather than words alone. Light continued to shift across the dunes, casting shadows that emphasized the contours of the terrain, and Ethan moved deliberately, positioning himself in view so Zyra could measure distances and slopes while remaining safe and confident. They paused near a gentle rise, letting her rest as they watched the vast desert stretch out below them, waves of gold and bronze catching the last sunlight, and Ethan gestured toward distant ridges, explaining how to use them as markers for direction and stability, which Zyra observed and absorbed attentively. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of distant flora, and Ethan carefully handed her a container of water, ensuring she could drink without difficulty, which she accepted with deliberate movements, a subtle acknowledgement of the trust that had developed. Shadows deepened as the sun approached the horizon, and the soft glow of twilight reflected across Zyra's skin, highlighting intricate lines and textures, each movement captured in the amber light. Ethan used gestures to communicate upcoming challenges in the terrain, and Zyra mirrored his observations, adjusting her steps with cautious precision, the synchronization between them growing more natural. As darkness crept over the desert, the first stars began to punctuate the sky, and the shared silence between human and alien carried a profound sense of understanding, a recognition of patience, guidance, and emerging trust. Each step taken in the waning light reinforced the connection, subtle, deliberate, and unspoken, as the desert enveloped them in its vast, quiet expanse, the horizon glowing faintly behind them, marking the close of a day and the anticipation of what would come next under the deepening night sky. Night had fully settled over the desert, the stars piercing the inky sky above, and Ethan and Zyra paused atop a gentle dune, their forms outlined against the faint silver of moonlight that washed over the rippling sands. The wind whispered softly, carrying the scent of dry stone and distant flora, and Zyra lowered herself slightly, the subtle flex of her massive shoulders and the tilt of her head signaling trust and acknowledgement of the bond they had built. Ethan crouched beside her, careful to maintain presence without imposing, his hands brushing over the sand as he demonstrated stability and safety, and Zyra mirrored the movements, her fingers testing the ground in tandem with his guidance, the rhythm between them synchronized without words. Shadows from the dune rolled gently beneath their feet, elongating as the moon traced its slow path across the sky, and Ethan gestured to a distant ridge, explaining through motion how the contours of the desert could be read and used to navigate safely. Zyra following his cues attentively, her eyes reflecting both light and understanding. The quiet was profound, broken only by the soft sigh of shifting sand, and Ethan offered a small container of water, steadying it so that Zyra could drink with ease, and she accepted, a deliberate, careful movement, her trust evident in the subtle relaxation of her posture. They moved slowly along the crest of the dune, each step measured and intentional, testing stability, observing subtle shifts in sand, and communicating through gestures and presence rather than speech. A partnership formed in quiet attentiveness. The moonlight caught the patterns on Zyra's skin, revealing intricate lines that glimmered faintly, and Ethan used the illumination to guide her over uneven areas, the reflective panel catching additional light to enhance visibility without startling her, creating a gentle interplay of shadow and glow that accentuated the textures of both the desert and her form. As they progressed, Ethan pointed to distant markers, subtle ridges, and color changes in the sand, helping Zyra understand the nuances of navigation in this vast expanse, and she responded with precise adjustments in posture and step, absorbing the knowledge with careful observation. The night deepened, cool air settling around them, carrying distant echoes of wind through the dunes, and Ethan paused, letting Zyra rest and absorb the landscape, his eyes scanning the horizon, noting shapes, shadows, and subtle shifts that might indicate safer paths or points of interest. She mirrored his focus, massive hands brushing lightly over the sand, sensing the micro changes in texture, the rhythm of the desert, and aligning herself with the cues he provided, an unspoken communication of respect and understanding forming in the space between them. The vast desert stretched endlessly, the stars reflected faintly in the sand and in her eyes, creating a mirrored infinity that held both awe and familiarity, and Ethan realized that this journey, begun in caution and curiosity, had transformed into a connection that transcended words. As they stood together, silhouetted against the horizon, the quiet partnership they had cultivated radiated through the night, the moonlight casting soft, reflective patterns, and in that suspended moment, Zyra tilted her head, eyes meeting his with a hint of recognition, and for the first time, there was an unmistakable sense that the desert had borne witness to the emergence of mutual respect, understanding, and a fragile, luminous bond that could not be captured in speech but only felt in the shared presence of two beings navigating the vast, eternal sands together.